Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for stopping by this session. My name is Karar. I'm the Chief Digital Officer at Finta Galaxy. I'm very delighted to be here with you today as part of the Open Banking Week Global 2021. Our topic today is of quite interest to me and something I'm really passionate about, which is about open finance and the opportunities that it creates in the financial services industry and the transformation of which. Now, allow me to first start off by just introducing myself and Finta Galaxy. I've been in the financial services industry for the last 15 years. Most of my career has been in North America, working for Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of Montreal, mostly in data and analytics. I'm a mathematician by training. And then most recently, after moving to the Middle East, my focus has been on digital banking, open banking, and I had some, great opportunities with FAB, our financial services, Deloitte, and considering my background, I love academia, so I taught a little bit at the University of Ottawa. Now, a bit about Finta Galaxy. Finta Galaxy was born in 2018, primarily as a platform that supports open innovation. And over the last 3 years, we've run over 30 innovation programs, launched multiple POCs across the region, and really built a solid network of partners, both on the fintech side, as part of our fintech marketplace, as well as on the institutional side, working with major large banks, as well as central banks and regulators. And speaking of that, we had a great success story last year around November, October, where we launched FinHub 973, which is the Central Bank of Bahrain's digital lab. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we continue forward. And the last thing I'd like to share is we also support financial institutions with their transformation, because our objective is really to help banks to become open and financial institutions in general. So part of that is really helping the financial institutions with their digital transformation. So we're very privileged to be working with one of the oldest banks in the region, and we're going to be helping them to transform to become one of the first challenger banks in the region. And just to give you an idea, here are some examples of the clients that we work with, both on the regulatory side and the financial institutions. Now, let's talk about the problem and why are we here and why all this effort and hype around open banking. And before I start, let me share with you just a bit of humor. You sometimes may see this in a boardroom where they're like, oh, open finance or open banking, it's years away. We don't have anything to worry about. We're not changing anytime soon. But the truth behind the matter is, with COVID-19 really sweeping across the globe, and with the push for things like remote work, contactless payments, things like more e-commerce and more online transactions, there has been, let's call it a wake-up call for these organizations. And now they're realizing that open finance is here, and it's here now to stay. And yes, in UK and Europe, they started their journey a while back. But I'm talking, again, from the perspective we have here in the Middle East and what we've been seeing as Finta Galaxy. And beyond COVID-19, some of the other drivers in the landscape are competition. And the interesting thing is, it's no longer, it's now an asymmetrical competition. You're not competing like for like, you're competing on experience, you're competing with the likes of GAFA, with big techs. You also have customer experience expectations. It's far more heightened. People are looking for anytime, anywhere, any device, and they're looking for different type of services. From a regulatory perspective, whether it's things like GDPR, KYC, whether it's things like open banking, which, by the way, is regulated in Bahrain, and it's at the moment Bahrain is leading the pack. But banks have to adhere with these regulations, and they have to open up their data. So there's another a big push, which is interesting because previously enterprises were transforming mostly because of just competition and customer needs, but now there's this new wave of transformation that's being pushed by the regulator. And last but not least, with new technologies, AI, blockchain, APIs, all of that, we see that it's really accelerating the push. Now, part of the problem that we're seeing is that financial institutions are being disrupted, and smaller players, and sometimes even non-financial service players, are coming in, and the market is being usurped. Now, what's also important to note is the challenge is both on the fintech side and the financial institution side. So, and this is again why Finta Galaxy, came to life. When you think about financial institutions, they want to collaborate, and the old saying, if you can't beat them, you join them. So we're past that. But the issue is it's very hard to identify the fintechs and then integrate with the fintechs and go through the process, especially when we're talking fintechs that need to be regulated or went through a regulatory sandbox or obtained any certain type of licenses for regulated activities. And on the fintech side, the exercise of going through integrating with the bank is very time consuming and very resource intensive. On the financial, on the central bank and the financial regulator side, you'll find that they struggle to try to keep up with a lot of the disruptive technologies that are coming to the market. And, and again, from very intimate experience working with regulators in the region, we find that there's sometimes that lack of oversight. And it's simply because a lot of things are happening very fast, and there isn't that mechanism that allows them to monitor and oversee most of these new trends and these shifts in the market. So really, when you look at it, you look at this, mishmash. You've got fintechs in different regions, some connecting to a regulatory sandbox, some connected to a technical sandbox with some test APIs. Some are connected directly to a production environment with a given bank. Different regulators have different requirements and different sandboxes, so make it very difficult for fintechs to become more regional. And financial institutions are, as I mentioned, having trouble trying to, find the right fintechs, connect with them, and the process in its entirety, whether it's the identification of the fintech, the technical qualification, the regulatory authorization, the integration, the commercialization, is not very fluid and it's not very streamlined. So this is where we thought, okay, what can we do as market enablers and as facilitators? And this is when Phoenix 22 was born. Phoenix 22 is our platform, and the name came from the tagline of one API, 22 Arab markets. And the whole idea is really to bring that entire journey that I described under one umbrella. So unlike technologies like Ozone API or TrueLayer or the others, which are incredible technologies, but they serve for that one specific purpose, which is really helping with the integration and providing sandbox and documented APIs, developer portal, etc. Now imagine taking this and augmenting it with all of the other parts that support the ecosystem. So what you end up with is really your core technology layer that has the API gateway, that has the pre-built and customizable application programming interfaces, a customizable data model, standardized protocols, a developer portal for enhanced experience, the appropriate monitoring, reporting, strong authentication, fine-grained consent management, etc. But then you surround that with a marketplace. You surround it with the regulatory sandbox. You surround it with the matchmaking algorithms that help match fintechs with the financial institutions. And then you can expand it a layer further by adding the talent development aspect or the investor portal and so forth. So what you end up with is really this layer that caters to different parts of the ecosystem, but also more importantly, you add a layer that allows the financial institutions to comply. Now, the picture that you see right now is what we had launched with the CBB, the Central Bank of Bahrain, late last year, FinHub 973. And what we've done is also worked with them to understand the BOBF, the Bahrain Open Banking Framework, and understand, what are the requirements from an operational perspective, security perspective, customer experience perspective, and then worked with the banks to help them conform with the Bahrain Open Banking Framework. Now, as I mentioned, what you end up with is a very streamlined journey that really takes your fintechs, your innovators, your third-party service providers, and they can go through the startup acceleration, they can go through technical validation, they move over to the sandboxing, and whether the sandboxing here is the technical sandbox aspect, or further down the journey, the regulatory sandbox aspect, and really building that close and tight integration between the two, moving from testing to a proof of concept, developing whether it's an MVP, a minimum viable product, or an MMP, a minimum marketable product, or in even some cases, a minimum lovable product. And the platform also supports, fintechs offering their services through this API gateway. So really, supporting fintech as a service. And on the flip side, it can also support banking as a service. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the opportunities. And last but not least, once you go through this journey and you get to the point where you can commercialize and get your regulatory authorization, the idea is such a platform will allow the fintech services providers to scale and commercialize all through a single integration point. So let's actually talk about the opportunities and why is all of this happening? Well, ideally, financial institutions want to become an open finance enterprise. That's the target. And why do you want to do that? Because when you embed open finance into your organization and it becomes part of the DNA of the organization, you could really start to offer next generation, digital banking offerings, and not just banking, by the way. And I keep on, switching between open banking and open finance, but the idea is open finance is the broader umbrella. So you've got things like open insurance, you've got working with, exchanges, with, let's say, traders and brokerages and so forth. And the idea is you can all start to offer really the best-in-class customer experience through the idea of open finance. You can also start to create more value or create new revenue streams. And one of the ones that I'm very passionate about is creating revenue streams, not just for fintechs through their API monetization, but also flipping this around and creating banking as a service, and the banks monetizing and creating new revenue streams that really are enabled and powered by open finance. Also, when you become an open enterprise, you've got open data, you've got open APIs, you by default become an agile enterprise. Because let's face it, you cannot be legacy and doing old way of working and expect to have all of this type of open connectivity and working with fintechs and startups that are very quick and turning things around, and especially if you want to keep up, right? So what that happens is you end up with an organization that also aligns its workforce and their mindsets with the new vision of an open enterprise. Additionally, as part of being an open finance enterprise, you have the connectivity. And the connectivity, as I mentioned, is not just with fintechs, but it could also be with non-financial service providers. You could be connecting with gaming apps. You could be connecting with food delivery apps and so forth. And again, I'll cover a couple of examples on that later. And then the last couple of points I want to highlight as part of being an open enterprise is data. Data is the new gold. Data is the new fuel. Well, guess what? As part of being an open finance enterprise, you will have access to a tremendous amount of data, and you'll be able to start to monetize this data and use the data to offer hyper-personalized experiences, to mitigate risk, to proactively combat fraud, and so forth. And I wouldn't be doing this justice if I ignore the regulatory aspect. And there is another, when we talk about use cases about open finance, a lot the ones that started were mostly about data aggregation and payments initiation and SME, credit scoring, etc. But again, some of the ones that I'm finding quite enjoyable more lately are also the RegTech, and how can you leverage open finance and open APIs to enable regulatory compliance, and of course SupTech for supervisory technology as well. So let's talk about where organizations are mostly playing right now and where they need to be. A lot of organizations that may have started off just exploring, the idea of open connectivity. And for those who are listening to this in North America, you probably would have heard of OFX, which is the Open Finance Exchange, and the concept of screen scraping, which is really dates back as early as 1997, which shows you that open banking and open finance technically started way back then, but really with the work that happened in the UK with PSD2, that's when it became a bit more standardized, and the data protection, GDPR, etc. And most banks play in the doing. They're just doing open things, open API. But still, largely, the underlying business model is the same. They haven't gone to the extent of monetizing APIs. They haven't built, let's say, integrations where fintech solutions are built into their own solutions, or so forth. And then there is becoming an open finance enterprise. And typically, I put down 12 months because that's usually the time frame, especially, based on firsthand experience, seeing how Bahrain, when they, pushed out the regulation, first off in June of 2019, yes, I was actually in Bahrain at the time, working with our financial services, and it really they gave the banks, that type of time frame, and guess what? With the right enablers and the right facilitators and partners, such as Finta Galaxy and others, they were able to build out their at least basic infrastructure to become an open finance enterprise and support some of the basic open banking capabilities. Now, what's interesting is now with the, fast forward to November 2020, the Bahrain Open Banking Framework comes out, and now it's an open finance mandate. And really the idea through the hub that we launched is really connecting, as I mentioned, the insurance companies, the brokerages, and so forth. So when an organization reaches that level of maturity where they become a true open finance enterprise, there is a complete mindset shift. And the organization also, and again, I'm looking at this from a MENA perspective, Middle East and North Africa, because we in this part of the world are still not there yet. So unlike some organizations, let's say Starling, they are an open finance enterprise, and they've done it very well, and they've changed their business model, and they're continuing to evolve. But it's already that transformation has already happened. But when you talk about organizations here in the Middle East, that's the aspiration, right? Is in a span of 2 years with a very laser focused approach and a fast fail approach to innovation and to, let's call it rapid and convergent experimentation with fintechs and APIs, etc., you could really get to that point where you become a true open finance enterprise. Now, I want to give an example about, a RegTech use case. And this is an example of an innovation challenge that's currently actually launched as part of Supernova, which is an innovation challenge that we are running for the Central Bank of Bahrain. Now, the MOJ, the Ministry of Justice, typically sends the Central Bank of Bahrain, a list that says these individuals, we need to block their accounts. And I'm using this case study to actually help you realize some of the opportunities when we talk about open finance and transforming financial services. So what the central bank has done, they've built something called the BOB system, which is their internal account blocking system. And all it is, it's a database with an interface. And what happens is, the Ministry of Justice sends the list to central bank. Central bank updates their BOB system, and then the BOB system will send an email to all the banks. And when the email goes out to all the banks will go back to the BOB. They will download a CSV file, and they will check their core banking system. And that checking is done manually by their operations team. We've talked to the banks, and 90% of them are using this approach. Some of them are trying to use some RPA, which, by the way, it may not be the most secure, but we'll get to that in a second. And then they have to go back and communicate with the BOB system again through an online portal. Now, what's interesting is when we launched the challenge and we talked to the Central Bank of Bahrain, there was a discussion that said, okay, what if we wanted to do something a bit different, i.e., let's build an API interface for the BOB system. Remember the previous diagram when I was saying, there's the, you're doing some open finance things. Well, that was an example of I'm going to build an integration point. I'm going to build an API layer, but it's for that one system. And I'm going to connect with the banks. But then what you end up looking at is what happens if you have multiple systems? The BOB system for account blocking and unblocking. What if you have an internal blacklist that you need to maintain? What do you have? Bounce checks, that's another system. And what if there are multiple entities on the left-hand side, not just the Ministry of Justice or public prosecution or whomever else? So what you end up happening is you're doing some open finance things and connecting through an API layer, but it's not a true standardization. It's not a true open, API protocol. And this is where we came back to the central bank and we said, hey, how about you consider this and let's see what comes out of the innovation challenge. But if you find a fintech that could help you streamline, so all of your internal systems will go through one open finance API layer, and it becomes a single integration point, and then the banks connect with that single integration point. Now think about that. When you do that, you actually gain a couple of benefits. One, the whole process could be done through a fully end-to-end automated approach. It's an extensible approach because now it doesn't matter how many entities are sending instructions to the central bank and how many banks are connected. It's all automated and it has no human intervention. I get the list, API call, hit up the core banking. Does this name exist? Yes. Block, what's the amount, and then API response, confirm back to the central bank. And remember, I was talking about oversight. This is an example of oversight and an example of RegTech and control. And the other thing that's really nice about this is, you have better privacy and information security because, like I said, sometimes when you're using an RPA solution, you can't necessarily encrypt, the data, the CPR, which is the national ID, or the account information, etc. But when you're doing with APIs, all this data is encrypted both at rest and in transit. And the other thing that we note here is that this is a one-time integration. Once a bank integrates to this one, standard API layer that is owned and managed by the regulator, guess what? If other fintechs that are going through the regulatory sandbox, or that are going through, or have actually gone through an integration as well as part of their qualification program, can now provide their services to these financial institutions. So the example is you have a bunch of fintechs and they have APIs that they've exposed through the technical sandbox. They've done the technical testing in the sandbox. And then once it comes time to production and they're authorized, they get a new API token. So a bank that's already integrated is using the same language, right? So they just need that new endpoint, that new URL, and they can consume the production APIs for a fintech if they've already gone through the validation through the sandbox environment. Now, it's important to know that it's not just about the technology, right? It's a complete rethink of the end-to-end journey. And it's a rethink of how can you deliver more value. So integrating the APIs with your core banking, looking at your legacy systems, whether it's core banking systems in case of a bank or databases in case of insurance companies, etc., and understanding that part of open finance is really having this sandbox. It's extremely important to allow fintechs to, and even internal teams within financial institutions, to do some rapid experimentation, as I mentioned, and be able to plug and play with the opportunity to easily switch to production the moment solutions are ready and vetted. The idea of having a focus on onboarding partners in the ecosystem, having the appropriate data management, especially for test data, looking at the flow, because when you think about it, the flow of data in and out of an organization is something that could see some unprecedented load as open finance becomes more and more open and more available, I should say, in the region. And of course, building in having the governance and security, understanding, the API economy and the business operations and the business model that come with it, having the right support for developers internally and externally, and then finally building on hackathons and innovation challenges and really building the API marketing. So it's very interesting when you think about it. There are many use cases, and I don't need to go into all these details because these are the use cases that a lot of us are familiar with. We've seen this done quite well in the UK and in Europe. Now, the one I'd like to touch a bit more on is the whole concept of BaaS, banking as a service. And here, there are really two models. You can either, and by the way, I use banking as a service, but again, if you are an insurance company and you have APIs that allow me as a third party to ingest data based on the customer's consent, where I can see, their claim history, or I can see the vehicle data, or I can do a comparison. This is also the type of monetization that a financial institution could put forward. So let's quickly take a look at these two examples. You've got, you can either sell via a third party, or you can sell to a third party. And, in the former, this is the example of Santander's loan API that enables businesses to apply for loans directly from within the accounting software. As an example, when you sell to a third party, this is where you're really looking at developing new APIs and new API-enabled products and services, and enabling this under new digital brand. So you think about challenger banks, you think about PFM, you think about organizations that partner with the bank and leverage the bank's API to offer brand new services of their own. So the example, when you look at the US, you look at Googleplex Bank. What they've done is they said, let's focus on the experience and let's build this bank account for the US market, but at the same time, let's also leave the banking side of it to the more experienced banks. So in this case, BBVA US and Citi, they're providing the infrastructure, they're providing the banking as a service. And there are pros and cons to each, and we can have a separate session to really talk about the concept of a platform and where do you find exponential value when you develop a platform, whether it's your own platform as a bank and on which you provide your products and services, or products and services of others, or if it's somebody else's platform and you're providing your products and services. So there's the aspect as well of that balance of data security and privacy, but then more importantly, the customer intimacy and the experience. And it's interesting to see that, I would say probably around 60 or 70%, it really is more around the movement of money and managing data and account and sharing data and identity. Now, the one that I also find very interesting is what Starling have done. And I mentioned this earlier. So Starling, they spent over $20 million developing its banking technology. So again, the infrastructure, the bank as a service. And right now they have 24 live clients. And what's interesting is they really focused on, very specific, let's call it offerings, payment services, account services, so the PISP stuff, the AISP stuff, and then the banking as a service. And what's interesting is when you look at the graph, you'll see in a span of a year, their payment processed grew sevenfold. And it was actually doubling every month. And to me, this is an incredible success story around how financial institutions can leverage open finance to create new revenue streams and to collaborate with other players in the market. And yes, there is again, still that mentality of, cannibalization of my own market share. But if it's done right, the banks themselves could start to benefit from this type of collaboration. And especially when you start realizing, and what I had shared earlier, an open finance enterprise really has the customer at its core and really has to have that mindset shift, both internally for its employees and for its customers, in order to achieve results like what we see here on the screen. So I'd like to wrap up very quickly. Just some closing thoughts. From our experience at Finta Galaxy, we are very passionate about open finance, and we see a massive potential here in the MENA region. We're talking, north of $7 billion of potential revenue opportunity. So again, whether it's the fintechs or the banks, there is a great, let's say, there's a great point where everybody can actually benefit if it's done right. We all know that digital disruption is something that runs deep, and we recognize that legacy banks, if they continue to do things the old way, that gap will increase, and then they will end up falling behind. Now, what's important is when you start looking at open finance and open banking, is really to think of a digital first approach, to think of anytime, anywhere, any device type of offering, and to think of a platform offering. There is no point in building small point solutions. And remember the graph I was sharing, this is where most banks have been playing, which is about exploring. So they will integrate a fintech through API, but it's a single point of integration, rather than building a gateway that allows you to do multiple integrations with multiple fintechs and multiple service providers and regulators and government entities, etc. It's also important to note that in order for you to become successful, you have to have that mindset of fail fast, have a clear strategy, build around transparency, have the internal governance around open APIs, around API marketing, around the API economy, around everything that really allows you to scale products and services under the umbrella of open finance. And then last but not least, and this is one area that, again, just for the sake of time, I haven't dove deeper into, but it's important to note that with all of these opportunities come a lot of risks. I don't want to paint a very rosy picture. There are risks around, data privacy. There are risks around security. It's interesting. Some fintechs in the US might still be using, OFX or screen scraping, rather than, moving towards OAuth. But then the concept of financial grade APIs, which is really the heightened level of security beyond OAuth, and building on mutual TLS and so forth. So really there are a few frameworks and protocols and technologies that can be leveraged to mitigate some of these risks. But it's important to have a clear view of these risks as you embark on this journey of open finance, and to also have the right governance in place in order to do it successfully. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you so much for your time. I hope you found this session beneficial. If you have any questions, or if you'd like to have any further discussions, by all means, just drop me a line. My contact information is right there. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.